Good afternoon. We're back with the Canik Tp9Da. It is their double action, single action version of their pistol. This is part one of a two-part series. Today I want to concentrate on how the weapon functions, how the decocker works, how the internal safeties work, and how the trigger bar works. Now, this is an 18-round pistol. They're 18 rounds, and they're manufactured by Decocker. They're the same exact tube as a Beretta 92, and the mag catch is cut differently on the Beretta, but other than that, they're identical. So it's a very reliable, very dependable magazine. So we'll check our weapon again, make sure it's clear. All right, so this is the Tp9Da. The DA stands for double action. It's not double action only, it's single action, and if you choose to decock it using this decocker right here, you can decock the weapon, and let me show you. You have a cocked striker indicator here. When you decock the weapon, it decocks the striker without firing the weapon. Then once you do that, the trigger is able to cock the striker mechanism and release it. So it's double action first shot, single action after that. It's traditional double, single, if you choose it to be. Some people carry it just cocked, so it's single action, but the trigger has some take up on the first trigger pull, and there's no tension on it. You're just pulling against a light spring inside the weapon, and it presets the trigger to the single action position. And this trigger has just a little grit in it. I've not cleaned the weapon from the factory. It's brand new. It hasn't been shot yet. So once I clean it up and grease it, hopefully some of that grittiness comes out of that take up right here. But it does have a very nice single action trigger pull. Once you're against the wall on it and you break the release, it's a very nice trigger, and it's got very little reset. So we'll go ahead and break it down and take a look at it. All right, you can see that it disassembles. It has two disassembly levers on either side, and what you do is you just take the tension off the slide, pull the levers down, release the trigger, and it slides off. So here's the basic weapon broken down. It's got a captured recoil spring on a steel guide rod. You have your barrel, and the machining looks great on this. I don't see any machining flaws or marks. There's no visible tooling marks. Okay, and then here's your slide. And then your frame. Now the take up on the trigger bar, on that initial trigger pull, you're just pulling against the spring. So I can feel the grit right there, so I'm sure it's just something that needs to be cleaned up and lubed. So I'll explain how the trigger bar works in a second, and how the decocker works. So I've coated the tip of my pointer in orange, and hopefully that makes it easier to see. So your trigger bar is connected to the trigger right here, and as you squeeze the trigger to the rear, you can see the trigger bar moves to the rear. It's got two separate cams on it. All right, if you look inside the slide, I'll try and line these up for you. So if you look inside the slide, you can see that that your firing pin safety is right here. All right, that has to be depressed for the firing pin to move forward into the breech, through the breech face and fire the cartridge. When this is pulled to the rear and it's under spring tension and it moves forward, you can see here that the firing pin is not protruding through the breech face. If I push in on this safety, now you can see that the firing pin moves through the breech face and would impact the primer. When I let go of the firing pin or the striker, it retracts itself under the spring tension, the safety resets itself, and your firing pin safety again prevents the striker from moving through and firing the weapon. So the trigger has to be pulled that initial motion here to turn off that safety. And you can see how that would ride across the safety to disengage the safety. Now, the second cam is right here, and this is actually to reset the trigger bar after you fire the weapon. There is a groove right here. Alright, so this acts like a cam. So the trigger bar rides inside of this groove, and what happens is once I fire the first shot, the slide moves to the rear, and that cam inside the slide will push the trigger bar down to reset it. So that will reset the sear, allowing the sear to capture the back of the firing and cock the weapon. Now, the way this works is we'll describe single action first. So once I cycle the slide, this sear right here, you can see the tip of this sear. This part of the sear will engage this part of the firing pin. So as the slide comes forward again, the sear catches the firing pin. It will pull it fully cocked and hold it. So what you can do is see, I'm going to reset the trigger bar, and I'll use one of my tools here. So the firing pin catches right here. The sear holds it in place. I can reset the trigger when I go to fire it again. See, none of that movement does anything against the sear. Whoops, sorry, that was my mistake. None of that does anything against the sear. Once I pull back to this position and get it against the release, when I squeeze just a little bit more, it would release the firing pin and allow it to go forward. So this will stay locked until you pull the trigger all the way to the rear. And then you can see it'll move down and allow the firing pin to move forward. Now, it's true single action. The trigger, once you cycle the slide and the striker is cocked, the trigger does nothing else to cock the sear, or I'm sorry, to cock the striker any more than it's already cocked. Other guns, as you squeeze the trigger to the rear, there's some additional movement of the striker or the firing pin, and with this weapon there's no additional movement. All it does is release the firing pin, and that is why the single action trigger tends to be so good in this. Now, the way the decocker works is, you can see in the slide right here, you can see there's an opening right here. It's right below the decocker. So when if you can see this here, when I squeeze the decocker out, you can see that there is basically an angled cam that pushes down. So now what that does is that will, when it's on the weapon here, you can see that it will engage this lever. When I push the decocker down, it engages this lever. And how this works is, when the striker's against the sear there, that decocker comes down, pushes it back, and it allows that sear to release. So what's going to happen is when that sear releases, it allows the striker to fall forward, and it catches, the firing pin catches itself on this part of the trigger bar. If you can see here, there is a stop in front of the trigger bar, right in here. So this part of the firing pin is engaged in this part of the trigger bar. So as the trigger bar moves to the rear, right here, let me use the orange tip, right here, the trigger bar will draw it to the rear and then move downwards and allow the striker to slip off of it moving forward. That part of it is very similar to how a Glock works. When the cruciform on the trigger bar moves against the connector, it pulls the trigger bar down and the cruciform releases the firing pin firing the weapon. This is very similar. So on the double action shot, the trigger bar moves the firing pin or the striker to the rear. It will move down and slip off of it, allowing the striker to fall forward firing the gun. Once the weapon cycles, the cam in the slide as it moves to the rear will push this down. It'll reset your sear. As the firing pin moves forward in the slide, it will catch the sear. The sear will hold it in place. You release the trigger for single action. You can see that nothing moved forward except for the trigger bar. The sear did not release. When I put tension back on the trigger, it will slip. The sear will move down, allowing the firing pin to move forward. This slide will cycle again, reset the trigger. It'll lock your sear in place. When I fully release the trigger, you can see the trigger bar returns forward. The sear is still being held in place. So then when you decock it, here, let me put tension back on it. When you decock it, it allows that sear to fall down. The firing pin will move forward and catch the front of the trigger bar. It'll catch in this notch right here on the trigger bar. And that will hold it in a double action position. So the second shot, or the following shot would be double action. So that is basically how the trigger bar works. It's a very, very safe design. If for some reason the trigger bar failed to catch the striker mechanism would still just disengage from the sear, move forward, and it would hit the firing pin safety and still not fire. So it's got a redundant safety system for decocking it. So I won't worry about, having any problems with that. Now, that's basically just how the trigger works. It's a very simple system, yet it gives you an extremely smooth single action trigger pull. And the double action trigger pull is, a little heavy and a little gritty, but we'll see if that works itself out after we put some rounds through it and have it cleaned up. The locking block is similar to most other polymer guns. It's embedded in your polymer frame with a trigger pin. That second pin actually passes through it. I believe it passes through the front of the locking block right here underneath this forward piece. All right, then other items, you have a machined ejector. All right, you've got your extended slide release. Now the length of it is extended, but it's flush with the weapon. But it's very easy to get your thumb on and release. Here's your disassembly cam. When you pull this down, you can see that it just pulls the locking mechanism out from between the recoil guide rod and the lug on the barrel, and it'll release the slide, moving it forward. All right, let's go ahead and get this assembled again. All right, so that's the assembly. It's very simple. Now, what I want to do is I want to show you this safety right here. If I do not depress this drop safety as I squeeze the trigger, the gun will not discharge. If I pull it back without my finger firmly pushing on that safety, it will not allow the weapon to discharge. That safety is a drop safety. The weight of the trigger bar and of the trigger can move to the rear if you drop the weapon and it happened to land in this position. Just the inertia that trigger has would move to the rear, firing the weapon. What this safety does is, as I squeeze it, it allows that drop safety to turn off, and then it allows the trigger to move to the rear, firing the weapon. Fired again, single action. If I choose to, I can let my finger off the trigger, decock the weapon. It's decock the striker, put the trigger in a double action position. I can then squeeze the trigger all the way to the rear, firing the weapon. So that's double action. Then the slide would cycle. The next shot is single action. Now, one really neat thing about this weapon is it gives you a second strike capability. I love being able to just release the trigger and pull the trigger again in case of an ammunition malfunction. And this is a second strike capable trigger. So let's say that I went to shoot the weapon. You know, maybe I was in single action, maybe I was in double action, whatever it was. If I squeeze the trigger and nothing happens, to have a second chance on that cartridge, all I have to do is release the trigger, squeeze it again, and it would have a second chance or a third chance. You know, you could then cycle it out if it doesn't discharge, and you're back to single action again on a fresh cartridge. So very nice feature. I'm going to go ahead and run some rounds through it after this and see how it does. It's got really nice high profile sights, very easy to see and very easy to shoot. It's got your mag release here is very easy to reach from your shooting hand. Slide release is easy to reach. It's very comfortable. It's got a fantastic grip. The grip on these are just awesome. You know, very high quality, good craftsmanship, and we'll see how the durability and the reliability are. Oh yeah, I'll set up to just fire a few rounds through it to see how accurate it is before I do a detailed shooting video on it. Thank you very much. Okay, so we're back with the Canik Tp9Da. I'm going to run 18 rounds through it just to see how the sights are set up and see how accurately I can shoot it before I even clean it from the factory. So we'll go ahead and run the 18 rounds through it. I'm shooting Blazer brass, 115 grain full metal jacket. So we'll see how this does. Alright, so there was 18 rounds. You can see it's clear. That That was 18 rounds at 5 meters. And the top shot that is out of the group, I did that. That was a bad flinch on my part.